Okay, so tonight is officially the halfway mark through our study on current issues facing our children. And for those who may be visiting or anybody who's watching online for the first time, we're really talking about what I'll call cultural issues that we all face, but really focusing in and thinking about specifically how we can help our kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, other young folks in the congregation navigate this. And the scary part is that this list could have been a whole lot longer, or is a whole lot longer, and we could have covered a lot more subjects. And a lot of the things, as you look up here at this list, a lot of these things really can serve to separate us, especially as parents, from our kids. And some of the things that we have talked about and will talk about are really almost specifically designed to serve that function, to really separate us either by taking up their time or directly contradicting the influence that we have in their lives. So tonight we're going to talk about femininity, if I can say that correctly. And this will be my last week for this go-around, and I'll be back to Ryan next week. And it's interesting, the next couple of weeks really, I think, build on what we've covered over the last month or so in truth, and what the Bible has to say about being men and women, young men and young women, and because of Friends that we'll talk about coming up, and certainly many of the secular and culturally prevalent views that are out there, they directly contrast a lot of the stuff that we've talked about so far this quarter. So look forward to hearing Ryan talk about some of those things. All right, so we'll jump right in. As always, comments are not just welcomed but solicited. Tonight specifically, ladies, feel free to raise your hand and be vociferous participants as we talk about this tonight. All right, so question one, how would you describe or explain the cultural definition of femininity, right? So a lot of these questions are going to be the female version of exactly the same question that we talked about and discussed and asked last week. So what do we think? The temperature is affecting everyone's level of participation so far. Yeah.
We're talking about the cultural definition, not our definition.
Correct. Yep.
All right. Here's my least favorite. If you got it, fine.
Okay. Yep. So beauty and what that means, it would certainly be maybe part of that and really important, and oftentimes the center and focus of what this means. What else? So I think about the way that it was, right? And then the way that we have maybe changed recently, right? So if you think about, I talked about Ward Cleaver last week, so I'll talk about his wife, I think June, was that her name? June Cleaver? So, right, all those black and white shows from decades ago, right? So when they show the house is absolutely spotless, and the wife is there with her dress and high heels and vacuuming the floor around, right? That's a little bit different, I think, than it is than we think of it maybe today, right? So here's some of the things that I came up with. The idea of being delicate. There is, I think, some ways in which that would absolutely be correct. Physical appearance, we talked about beauty already. Right, so just the idea of nurturing, and caring, being oriented or inclined towards service. Passiveness is one that is kind of listed or talked about when you think of, a lot of these would be considered, I don't know, traditional or old-fashioned or stereotypes to some extent. Gentle. Interestingly, the same place that I went to look for some of the ideas from last week, and we got men as being independent. Same place, the idea of women being dependent, which was an interesting contrast there. So how's it changed over time? So we talked a little bit about maybe some of what you think of with that but the initial discussion here about it. So what has changed over time, specifically, I don't know, the last decade, maybe the last 2 decades? Is there anything that you can think of that is specifically different than what we have listed up there?
The mode of dress in some have, well, there's no masculine and feminine anymore. There's this unisex look to some degree. So you sometimes have to take a second or third look to determine the sex of the individual. So there's the rebound, maybe a long distance from what it used to be.
Yeah. So one of the things we talked about last week, similar idea with men, right? How what is considered acceptable has changed over time, and then in some ways it has gotten more feminine, right? So same idea here. In some ways, the dress and what's acceptable is kind of gotten more masculine for the ladies as well, right? What else?
Yeah. So I saw a recent commercial for Nike that was featured all women in various athletes, and the very first thing it said was, "It's okay to focus on number one."
Yeah.
And I think about the distinction to being dependent before, and now the reversal. Like, hey, you're just like men do.
Yeah.
You're number one. You're looking out for number one.
Yeah, so I think that is definitely definitely part of it, right? So just a couple thoughts to summarize where I sort of landed on this, right? One of the big ones is that women can do anything in the last couple of years, literally anything that men can do, okay? And that any kind of falling under any sort of those traditional expectations or definitions at all, any kind of stereotype is considered not valuable, not even just kind of neutral, but actually considered weak or less than desirable or problematic even in some ways of thinking. And that just the traditional way that we talk about femininity has largely been rejected as being outdated and or just restrictive overall. I think Stu, to your point, right? One of the things that we'll spend a little bit more time on, hopefully at the end, if we have time here, is the idea that used to the height of womanhood and femininity was having children and raising a family, and that's kind of all being moved to the side, almost as that's a burden that you don't have to bear, right? That's not even really what you should want to do, but the idea of, hey, being independent and doing what you want, and maybe not getting married and not having kids so that I can go fly and travel around the world and do what I want, as opposed to being having to sacrifice and give up some of what I want for someone else. Okay. All right, so let's take a look and see what Scripture says. We could probably just go to Proverbs 31, not probably. We could go to Proverbs 31 and just camp out here for the rest of the time. But we will take a look, and then we will go some other places as well. All right, so Proverbs 31, and we'll jump down to verse 10 and start there. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. And she seeks wool and flax, and she works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor, and she reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household. She does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruits of her hands, and let her work praise her in the gates. All right, so what qualities, characteristics, traits? There's a whole bunch that we could list, right? But what do we get out of that, Ben?
Well, to start off with, at the very end, number one, she fears the Lord. So there's reverence that she has for God. Number two, she has respect from her family, both her husband and her children, give her honor. And so there's a lot in there, but those are two to start us.
Yeah, no, those are good. Dan?
So I have a little different perspective on Proverbs 31 than most do. I think if you take Proverbs 31 and the picture of this woman literally, if you say this is literally a woman that describes a valuable or a worthy woman, you have a woman who, number one, is extremely wealthy. Children and family are clothed in the finest garments. You have a woman who is literally physically busy from sun up to sundown, not sure where her time for her family comes in. She is actively involved in real estate. And she is very, very, very busy in the physical things of the world. A picture that was presented to me years ago that I personally think makes a lot of sense is that the key to this proverb is the fact that she's making clothing for her and her family, and that in the latter part of that, it defines her clothing as strength and dignity. And that so much of this is not a woman who is literally, physically busy in the affairs of the world, but a woman who is busy and active in caring for her family and providing these things that bring honor to her family. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, I think the thing that stands out here is this is a woman who is not idle. This is a woman who is active in trying to bring honor and dignity to her family. And I think one of the things that stands out to me in our world, and I think one of the mistakes that Christians have made for many years, is that picturing this, what we have called here the traditional role, we have not explained the value of that. We've not done a good job of explaining that value to our children. We've not done a good job of demonstrating that value to the world. That somehow a woman who is busy caring for her family, as this woman does in Proverbs, is just as valuable as the guy who goes out and makes millions of dollars. Because she is the one who is establishing the foundation for her family. And while the man has a certain amount of roles and responsibilities, clearly much of the child rearing, much of the faith building falls at the feet of the mother, who spends far more time with the children, providing the ability for the others to be involved in what they're doing. And, I go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, and looking, and you've got it on there, so you're probably about to get to this, but, the thing that has always been emphasized to me is that no man can take the place of a woman. No man can do what God designed a woman to do. I'm not talking about just the physical aspect.
Sure, yeah.
God said, man's lonely, man needs a right kind of companion, and he made a woman. She is the perfect companion for man. And I think we have failed to emphasize the value that God put on that and that brings. And so in so doing, women have sought to find value elsewhere because we have failed to do what Proverbs 31 talks about, to do what Genesis 2 talks about, and properly value what a worthy woman really is.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I would agree with I think a lot of that. So I sort of summarize this as strength and resilience, right? If you think about all the different tasks that she is doing and participating in, that none of that stuff is easy, right? And it absolutely is a lot of hard work. All the things that she does for her children and for her family, and doing that in such a way to be honored and praised, even just by her husband, much less everyone else. That's a lot of resilience, a lot of work. I do absolutely agree with you that we probably don't do a fantastic job at selling the importance of this role. And we've got a slide later on that if we get time, hopefully we get to it, have time, we can sort of talk about some of the real practical fallout as a result of that, and some of the things that's meant, some of the attitudes that are out there about the more traditional roles, etc. Anything else on Proverbs 31, Kyle?
Just as we were just saying, it seems the world diminishes sometimes the importance of the role of a wife and mother, and how somebody that's a manager of a household is, it's not as exalted as some worldly roles. I think we as Christians also sometimes have to be careful that we don't describe all of femininity just in being a wife and a mother. There are plenty of godly women in this world who may not be married, may not have any children, but they're serving God faithfully, and they have an important role to fill in the kingdom, and they may be doing things that we aren't going to be talking about tonight. And
yeah.
What a wife does, but that doesn't mean they're not godly women.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And again, hopefully, I do a better job at pacing today, and we get through, and we'll talk about some of those things specifically. All right, we'll go on to First Peter. I'm giving away the answers. All right, 1 Peter chapter 3. And we'll start just reading at the beginning. We'll go through the first 6 verses here, and this is going to overlap, with 1 Timothy that we'll look at here at the end. But likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word, but by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of your hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. All right, so what are your thoughts on what qualities, traits, characteristics can we pull out of this passage here in 1 Peter? There's one that should be like super obvious.
Respectful. She has a pure conduct. She's got a gentle and quiet spirit, and she submits to her husband.
Yeah, so I think you hit just about everything, everything that is there. I summarize that if you sort of go up to the 30,000 foot level and just, hey, the beauty of the heart, right? All those traits and characteristics, consistent with, the fruit of the Spirit. If you think about some of the things that we talked about last week, men are called to have sacrificial love, right? There's this self-denial that has to happen in order to do that. Same idea here, right? In order to submit, there's this self-denial that has to happen a lot of times. Hey, I want to do this, but I'm going to go do something else instead. Any other thoughts on 1 Peter? All right. Genesis chapter 2. And we'll start in verse 18 and read 7 verses there. What's that, through the end of the chapter? Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18. Then the Lord God said, "It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." Now out of the ground the Lord had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature was its name. The men gave names to all the livestock and all the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall on the man, and while he slept took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh, and the rib that the Lord God had taken from man he made into woman and brought her to the man. The man said, "This at last is a bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. All right, so what do we get from Genesis chapter 2 in terms of traits and characteristics? Tim?
As we read, and Dan's already mentioned, man was not good for him to be alone, so God solved that problem by giving him a woman, and she was his companion and helpmate. And she had a very important role in the very early period of creation.
Yeah, so specifically created for companionship, right? To provide relationship for Adam. Any other thoughts from Genesis chapter 2? Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good summary. Right, one of the things that typically women are really good at is just that relational capacity, the ability to be empathetic, the ability to be sympathetic, to understand, and kind of naturally have a desire a lot of times to build and foster relationships, be nurturing, right? Be that supportive partner and provide a complement to her husband. If you kind of think about back to Proverbs 31 and, what is really causing the husband to praise his wife, I would imagine that a lot of it is this relational capacity, right? The ability to relate to him and be supportive, and that in large part is what leads to her being praised. Ephesians chapter 6. This one may seem kind of odd. So it'll make a little more sense here probably if I intended to put Titus chapter 2 on here as well, so maybe that will help guide the answer and sort of give you a clue as to what I'm looking for. But Ephesians chapter 6, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So what do we get for women out of those 4 verses? It's just a general idea. You can also think back to Proverbs verse 31. All of these can also tie back there as well.
She is due honor just as the father is. And that sometimes falls on the father to make sure that takes place.
Yeah, absolutely it does, right? It does for sure. If that is not happening, we should certainly take a look at ourselves and say, hey, how am I contributing, or am I contributing to that not being the way that it should? Right, so if we go over to Titus, I'll just read Titus chapter 2, read a couple verses there. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, nor slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children. So really just, my thought here was just she's a teacher, she's a mentor. Again, if you go back to Proverbs 31, and he's reciting all of these things that he was taught by his mother at the beginning of that, and all the wisdom that she provided. Here, there's instruction on how the interaction between older women and younger women is supposed to be. There's instruction for older men. There's instruction for younger men. So a lot of good thoughts and places to look, right? But she's to teach her own children. She's to teach other women about a number of things, right? About God, about love, how to be the partner, how to have that relational capacity with your husband that he needs to get from you. And it ties in nicely, with 1 Peter, and you go back to, actually, that's the next one that we're going to talk about. Anything else on Ephesians chapter 6? All right, we'll go to the next one. And I'm going to go ahead and give away the answer, right? So 1 Timothy chapter 2, we'll go to verse 9 and start there. I know how my kids feel in Bible drill now, standing up here trying to find the verses while everyone's staring at you. All right, 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So again, a lot of the things that we've looked at over the past 2 weeks have had this idea of self-control, self-denial in what we need to be exhibiting and pass it on to our kids. So what else? I've got modesty and submissiveness that are pretty easy to pull out of this. What else? Anybody have anything else that they see in that, Chris?
Sadly, the message from the world is almost the exact opposite of this, right?
Yeah.
Especially on social media with kids later. That's the evil of social media. They're bombarded constantly about worldliness, immodest dressing, all those things.
Yeah, so unfortunately you're right? So if you there's a number of exercises that have been done specific to social media. One makes a post in kind of modest attire, and it doesn't really get a lot of traction. Exact same post, dressed differently, and all of a sudden the interactions and stuff start jumping up, right? So all the incentives and what girls were being taught is if you want attention, right, you have to dress immodestly. You have to focus on the outward beauty, and all of those things become really important.
I think if you summarize the woman in Proverbs 31, and you contrast it to the woman in Amos chapter 4, the woman in Proverbs 31 can be kind of summarized as someone that's unselfish. She's family-centered. Whereas the woman that's in Amos chapter 4 is extremely self-centered. She oppresses the poor and the needy. She says to her husband, bring me more. And we can see what God's attitude is about that. And it seems like our modern culture is really pushing women to be more self-centered, like the woman in Amos chapter 4.
Yeah, so absolutely. That is definitely the direction that the culture is going, for sure, without a doubt. Ben?
Two thoughts. One, I'm curious what the sisters might think. Two, this section here, three things here for sisters or women. Focus on the inside, learn to submit, and I know sometimes we have to have some caveats and things like that, but learn to submit and keep your role. Because going back to Genesis chapter 2, that's not a bad thing. Because God, He established roles for both men and women. And that's what you just read in Ephesians chapter 6, even for children. So I think the lens that we view these verses or passages becomes very important too, because on one hand, we can say, well, it's just too limiting or restricting. On the other hand, though, what the Holy Spirit is showing us here, this is how we're pleasing to the Lord, right? So there's responsibilities for men and for women, but Paul is laying out some things here specifically for the women. So for sure. I think maybe this, Ben, may have some of what you said. Curious what the thoughts are, right? So what does our society say about submissiveness in general, right? So we read Titus chapter 2. Just what is we've talked about it a little bit, but any additional thoughts or commentary on submissiveness?
So from a worldview, it seems like submissiveness may be viewed as a weakness, when it's actually the godly submissiveness is actually a strength.
Yeah, so for sure. I'm going to read this here, and it was like jarring to me when I read it, and then I realized, hey, this is probably right, and I think this kind of ties into some of the comments that Dan made earlier. So September of last year, there was an article in the New York Times that reported, for the first time in modern American history, young men are now more religious than their female peers. So I'm not sure exactly how they defined more religious, but the article cites a study by the Survey Center on American Life at the American Enterprise Institute, and according to this study, 65% of young women do not believe that women are treated equally in the church. The article states, for girls and young women raised to believe they can do anything men can do, this message is becoming more difficult to digest. So what are the thoughts on that's just a kind of quick excerpt and summary. But anybody have any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, I'll say there is a trend. I'm seeing it among brethren as well. Where women need to have or should have more expanded roles in a local congregation, and the Bible, I believe, teaches certain roles that are for men and for women. I kind of touched on that just briefly in my sermon on Sunday. But it is becoming a lot more, it's expanding. So when I was in Graham, Texas, there's a local Church of Christ there that just appointed a woman elder. And, so there are women who are looking for these roles or opportunities more. And so I think an understanding of what exactly are our roles in a local congregation for both brothers and sisters, and just being able to understand what we actually can do that's authorized by God. So I think there's probably, I think those stats are true.
Yeah.
what's happening in our society, anything that happens in our society has an impact on the church.
Sure.
Racism, what we're seeing now with respect to, hey, you can have these same roles as well. So it's something we need to be aware of. And, you know, when Dan mentioned earlier, making sure we all understand the value of these roles that the Lord has given us, we have them for a reason. And His way is always the best way. And so I think understanding that becomes even more important. And I think trusting that. You know, we can read these and say, well, I know what it says.
Yeah.
Trusting what this is teaching us to be the best way.
Yeah, I know.
I'll add one more thing too. You know, sometimes there have been different abuse as well with submissiveness and with men, which also I think has led to some of this problem too.
Yeah, no, there's definitely part of that as well, Dan.
Yeah, that was just similar to what Ben was just saying at the end of that, and I think so many times the things that we do that end up varying from the Word of God end up because we failed to do what God told us to begin with. Why do we end up with business meetings in churches? Why do we end up with women wanting to lead in churches? Oftentimes, the reason for this is because you have such a lack of the proper kind of leadership among men. You have men who fail to grow in what God would have them to be. And so, while it's great for us to talk one week about masculinity and the next week about femininity, one of the challenges in this is that God didn't create either of these in a vacuum. And when the reason our views sometimes get skewed is because men are either abusing their roles or not filling the roles that they should. And so women are saying, well, somebody's got to step up and do that.
Yep.
And so they step up to fill the vacuum. Or, as I said earlier, they're just not, we're not teaching and we're not setting the example of the value of the role that God has assigned to them, even as Kyle pointed out. Those roles are not necessarily associated with a role in marriage, but the things that a woman can do that can be of value and not simply recognizing what that value is.
Yeah, you're right. Unfortunately, a lot of times the message that women get is, you know, filling out a spreadsheet is the pinnacle of value. That's how you, maximize your potential as a woman, is, you know, jamming keystrokes into a spreadsheet for somebody. And unfortunately, a lot of people buy into that. Any other, Chris?
So, you know, submissiveness has come up multiple times, and for sure that's a command from God, right? Be really specific, like we as husbands have to look at ourselves, right?
Yep, absolutely.
This is a selfless act. If we're going to lead our houses, we have to be selfless. It's a selfless leadership as husbands, and we have to make that as easy as possible for our wives to do. Not by shirking leadership or what we're supposed to do, but it's not a lording over. It's a selfless leadership, and our goal should be to make submissiveness as easy as possible in our lives.
Yeah, so I think about, I don't know, somebody told me a long time ago, if you have to tell somebody you're in charge, that you're not really in charge. And so I kind of think about this, if you have to tell somebody, hey, you're supposed to submit to me, that means that I'm not doing, or if I have that desire, right? Not that that's ever happened. But if, I have this, like, hey, I feel like this isn't happening like it's supposed to, then I need to turn the mirror on myself, and that's really on me at the end of the day. Wade?
When we look at Ephesians 5:22, it says, wives will submit themselves to their husbands as to the Lord. You know, husbands look at that and say, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, you know, as to the Lord. But if we look at that and say, okay, if we, a lot of times we can look at our wives and criticize whether or not they're being submissive or not. A lot easier than when we look at ourselves and say, are we submitting ourselves to the Lord to the same degree that we expect our wives to submit themselves to us? And so it starts there. You know, you kind of like even Chris had been saying, you got to start right there. That submission is for everybody. You know, it's not just something that women are supposed to do.
Yeah, so for sure, right? So kind of the next question is, how do we teach that? Well, everyone's got a role in that, right? So wives are called to be submissive to their husbands, but we're all called to be submissive in a number of other ways, right? To our employers, to the government. There's lots of other ways that we can either support this idea of being submissive or subvert it as well, right? All right, we've got 4 minutes, so I've got one more question, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to go to, because both of them will probably take the next 4 minutes. Okay, so let me go with this one, right? And that was supposed to not show you the answers right away, but what advice, this is a question that we didn't get to last week, but we had the same question for men, right? What advice would you offer to a young man or a young woman who is being given advice to, push marriage aside, in the case of women, in favor of career or liberation or freedom? In the case of men, it's a lot of times because there's the idea now that the whole idea of marriage is unfair and it's going to end in divorce and you're going to come out on the short end of the stick, and so the better thing is to just not get married in the first place. It's very prevalent, it seems like now, for people to live together, and then once they have a child, then okay, I guess we got to get married now because we have a child together, but they weren't willing to do that up front. So I'll just go through a couple of ideas here, right? So obviously in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's not a requirement to be married. It's not a requirement to have kids. Paul, in that specific instance, says it's better in this circumstance if you don't, but certainly you can, right? So that's definitely not something that is a requirement, and singleness is perfectly fine and has value in what we're able to do and some of the services that you're able to provide to others around you as well, right? But it's the problem, I think, or what I was really trying to get at with this question, is just the idea that marriage as an institution is sort of under attack, right? And that there's a number of different arrows that are being shot that says this is not great. This is not what you want to do. Kyle?
I think also a lot of the damage that's happened to marriage is from inside a marriage. And so if I were to have an opportunity to encourage a younger person regarding marriage, one thing that often I feel like I'd be compelled to say is that your marriage doesn't have to look like your parents' marriage.
Right.
You come from a broken home, that doesn't mean you're going to have a broken home, or that you have to distrust marriage as an institution. God really gives us a pattern that leads to the most joyful type of life we've experienced in this world, and marriage can be a part of that, but it needs to be a godly marriage, not necessarily patterned after what you've seen in the world around you in your own home.
Yeah, that's one of the great things, right? Is we're not tied or restricted by what our parents have done before us. We've got the opportunity to go and do different things, act a different way, right? We already talked about Genesis and the idea of companionship and help and how we're supposed to complement one another. In Matthew, Jesus talks about how this was really created by God. And then I threw in a verse from Ecclesiastes that says two are better than one. At the end of the day, marriage is good, and it's also really, really important who you marry, right? So I think that's the other part of it. Ben?
For young women and men, for that matter, in the local congregation, it can be easy to focus or to hear about maybe marriages that are not doing the best, but also getting to know other couples, who have been married for decades.
Yep.
And talking to them, knowing that there's lots of marriages that are thriving and that are full of love, and so making sure that they're not just always maybe thinking, oh, this will never work. Maybe they sit in their home, mom and dad, and that's why. So hoping that that's an opportunity for older women to teach younger women Titus chapter 2. Here's some lessons I've learned for the men to do the same. So that'd be a piece of advice. Talk to the brethren here. I talk to those that have been married for 30, 40, 50 years. How do they do it? And, what we can learn from them.
Yeah, no, for sure. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that your friend group has a huge influence on how you end up, right? If your friend group starts to experience divorce, you're more likely to experience divorce. If your friend group stays married, you're more likely to experience that as well. So we have about 50 kids looking through the glass in the back at me. So we are done for today. Thank you very much.